Okay, welcome everybody. Tonight's speaker is David Kidwell, who grew up in southern Anne Arundel County, but now lives in the Damascus area, so he and I are not far apart. We ran into each other last fall looking for a reported Eurasian collared dove at the Damascus Rec Center. We didn't find the bird, but when we talked, we then talked about David presenting to the club about his work with NOAA, so here we are. David got his master's at the University of Maryland after studying the foraging ecology of sea ducks with the USGS Patuxent Wildlife Research Center. He started working at NOAA in 2007 and currently oversees a research team studying harmful algae blooms, the effects of sea level rise, and other ecosystem science. When not on a NOAA boat, Dave likes to bird at Little Bennett, and he tells me his parents are far away, but in a great place, southeast Arizona, which Cheryl just spoke about. And he just returned from seeing his parents and managed to find two rarities, including that rufous-capped warbler and a rufous-backed robin, two great birds. David got interested in birding when he worked as a park ranger for Anne Arundel County after undergrad studies, and says he loves exploring the world through birds and food as much as possible. Sounds interesting. Please welcome David Kidwell to tell us about his pelagic work with NOAA. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Mark, and good to chat with everybody. It was a good introduction. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Oh, you have disabled screen sharing, just to give you a heads up. But I'll go ahead and give the introductory remarks as they work on that that I would have given on my title slide at any rate. So this talk, as the name suggests, is going to give a bit of a primer on harmful algal blooms, touch on some of the science that's been out there on the impacts of harmful algal blooms on birds. We'll center a lot on some of the work that either my office is funding or that we're doing ourselves, but also highlight some of the work that I've been doing to study these HABs across the country, and then talk about some of the birding that I've done on some of these research cruises. The last thing I'll mention before hopefully I'm able to share my screen is most of the photos are from me, but where appropriate, I've added photo credit. Most of the figures are not mine, but most of the photos are ones that I've taken. And so with that, hopefully I'm able to share my screen now. It looks like I am, which is wonderful.
I just made you a co-host. Mark,
Excellent.
I had to reclaim the host.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Sorry.
All right, I want to share. All right, and then I want to do presentation view. All right, you all should all be seeing the full screen of the title slide. Let me know if not. But anyway, so let's just go ahead and get started on HABs. And so just as a bit of a primer for folks, harmful algal blooms is a bit of a kind of an overarching umbrella term that covers a wide range of species, from dinoflagellates to diatoms to cyanobacteria to macroalgae. And really what we're talking about in many instances are what most people would consider to be photosynthetic or at least partially photosynthetic microorganisms or macroalgae that are providing some type of harm to the environment. And I'll highlight that some of the species on here you probably will hear me talk about later in this presentation. The three at the top, certainly the one on the top left, the Alexandrium campanella, you're going to hear about particularly in Alaska. In the middle, the diatom pseudonychia, you're going to hear me talk about as it presents a toxin called domoic acid. And then I think many of you are probably familiar with cyanobacterial blooms. These occur in some lakes across Montgomery County. They're somewhat frequently occurring across really a lot of freshwater water bodies across the country. One of the things I'll highlight is cyanobacteria blooms are what keep me up at night. I have zero interest in getting near some of the toxic slurry that comes out of those organisms, but that's for another talk. So as I kind of alluded to, these issues are really widespread across the country and really across the globe. They often present themselves, or at least colloquially are known by their impact-based terms with shellfish. And so you'll hear terms like amnesic shellfish poisoning or diuretic shellfish poison. Sometimes things are referred to as red tides or brown tides or golden algae. And these are just various, local terms that sometimes have specific meanings to specific species or specific toxins, but other times can be a bit of also an umbrella term for what they're referring to. And with the prevalence of this issue across the country, you can imagine there's a lot of impacts. And so, many people might be familiar with the red tide that occurs off of the west coast of Florida. This is Carenia brevis that was actually highlighted on my first slide there. This produces a brevetoxin that can become a respiratory issue for people going to the beach. It can cause widespread issues with ecosystems, from having problems with seagrass to causing toxic impacts to birds and other wildlife. Off the west coast of Florida, or west coast of the United States, they routinely have issues with that species I highlighted earlier, Pseudonychia, blooming and providing or presenting domoic acid, which is a pretty nasty toxin that can get into shellfish. This is just an example of a newspaper headline of a closure of Dungeness crab fishing. I'll highlight that even just this past winter, there was a delay in the opening of some of the Dungeness crab fishery off the coast of the Pacific Northwest because of concerns around domoic acid that was accumulating in Dungeness crab. And then where I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about throughout my talk is in Alaska. And if you really ask me about what keeps me up at night when it comes to harmful algal blooms and the risks they present, it's in Alaska. For a variety of reasons that I'll get into a bit here in the presentation, I consider this to be kind of the leading edge of concerns around harmful algae. So, we've got examples of paralytic shellfish poisoning, which is caused by that Alexandrium catanella species, or there was a toxin called saxitoxin in Kodiak. There was a widespread bloom in 2022 in the Bering Sea region that caused a lot of concern in this region. Mostly because of the reliance on subsistence harvest and subsistence resources for daily living in sort of these remote areas of Alaska. I didn't include a headline here, but the most recent fatality that has occurred as a result of harmful algal blooms also occurred in Alaska, also occurred as a result of paralytic shellfish poisoning, and that was out in the Aleutian Islands about 3 years ago that occurred. And so obviously an area of significant concern. This is just touching on some of the impacts that really from a variety of species are occurring across the country. And I'll kind of circle back to the Bering Strait region of Alaska. And so just as a really poignant highlight of some of the risk and some of the concerns that are out there when it comes to these species, particularly with these remote communities, is I'll highlight a visit that I took that I was able to make to St. Lawrence Island. And I think many of you probably are familiar with the famous birding spot on St. Lawrence Island in Gamble. But not too far away on the island is the native village of Savunga. And so I spent some time with the community there talking about harmful algae and really trying to raise awareness of the concern and the issues that are surrounding them. And one of the stories that was related to me that kind of like took me aback was, I don't know if you remember several years ago, Typhoon Merbok hit this region of Alaska and really resulted in some devastating damage. But one of the things that it did was, because it was such a significant storm, that the strong wave action actually pulled shellfish from all what would normally be unharvestable areas of the Bering Strait region and brought them onto shore. And so a grandfather found a really fresh, large surf clam, which is really a delicacy for the community there. And the tradition is to then share that, starting with the youngest person of the family moving up. And he almost shared it with his 5-year-old granddaughter until he remembered some of the advisories that some of our partners put out around paralytic shellfish poisoning and decided to send it out for sampling. And it turned out that clam was 5 times the safe seafood limit that has been established for saxitoxins in clams. And so that was a near miss and really highlighted the concerns and the challenges, particularly in these remote areas, that these harmful algal blooms present. So here's another figure that stems from some of our work in Alaska. It was developed by the Woods Hole Institution. But really, this kind of encapsulates what we're talking about in terms of some of the impacts or many of the pathways of impacts that you see when it comes to harmful algal blooms. And so again, I mentioned a lot of the human-based concerns are around shellfish poisoning and consumption of shellfish that have toxins in them. I'd mentioned the issue in Florida where you can actually get some respiratory distress from toxins that are getting released via wave action. But really, when you're thinking about HABs, these are small phytoplankton most of the time. They're getting consumed by zooplankton, other planktonic or filter feeding organisms, and they can really bioaccumulate through the food web. And so we have ongoing studies now that are looking, particularly in Alaska, what the impacts are on a wide range of species, including marine mammals, including fish, other organisms, not only to understand the better trophic pathways that these toxins are proceeding through, but also particularly for communities that rely on what I've heard or what has been told to me is total usage of the marine environment, such as those in Alaska. Understanding these pathways become really important. And so there's a lot of work underway to determine this, but we're going to talk about birds a little bit more here. And so harmful algal blooms in birds is not new. We're talking about harmful algal blooms that have been around, really as long as there's been phytoplankton likely, although there's some recent evidence of human, impacts exacerbating or causing them in some instances. Many of these are naturally occurring. And so birds and HABs have been living together for a long time. And when it comes to their impacts, obviously the toxins are a concern. But when it comes to harmful algal blooms, just the sheer biomass of them can result in non-toxic impacts to many bird species. But when you're thinking about some of the exposure, you've got the food web issues that I just highlighted through the clams and fish. You've got direct exposure from getting onto their skin or ingesting water that might have toxins in it. But one of the challenges with studying this, although HABs themselves are fairly recurring across the country and across the globe, oftentimes you really get these episodic events that happen with birds. You get this mass bird die-off, and you're like, okay, what caused this? And you try to look at, okay, was there co-occurring harmful algal bloom occurring at the time? Yes or no? Was there perhaps toxins that were found in the remains of the deceased birds or the distressed birds? And sometimes, that leads you to a clear answer, and other times it doesn't. But one thing that's really clear is that it is almost assuredly an underreported issue. It is absolutely an understudied issue, and it's likely a growing problem. So some of these impacts, strandings and mortality events, I think that's pretty obvious. Birds that have been deceased washing up on shore. I'll showcase an example here of what I would call a stranding or distressed organism based events. But one of the things is that's really starting to emerge is, these acute based impacts are pretty obvious. You've got a deceased bird, you've got a distressed bird that's suffering some type of toxin impact, for example. But there's increasing evidence that there's likely impacts from chronic stress as a result of ingestion or consumption of toxins within the bird. And I already mentioned that the impacts can result from toxins in both toxins and high biomass. So I'm going to highlight a biomass issue here to start. And this is an issue that occurred a number of years ago, and it was still fascinates me to this day, because this was not a toxin-based impact. We're talking about thousands and thousands of seabirds that were impacted, and most of which deceased on the West Coast. And this was caused by a species called Akashua sanguinea. And this is not a toxin-based, but what this harmful algae was producing was a protein-based compound that, when there was sufficient wave action, was causing this foam that you see in the bottom of these pictures. And that foam was acting as a surfactant essentially, and was interfering with the waterproofing of seabirds. And so at least 14 species were impacted, and thousands were succumbing to hypothermia and other element-based issues because they had no waterproofing. And so it hasn't been much of an issue of this since then, but in 2007 in Monterey Bay, and then in 2009 off the coast of Oregon and Washington, significant issues and this is really the first time this type of impact from this species had been documented. And it really hasn't occurred since. And again, highlighting some of the episodic nature of these issues and the challenge that presents when it comes to studying the impacts both on birds and other organisms. Here's a good example of a toxin-based issue that results sometimes in mortality and other times in what I would consider strandings. And so brown pelicans are often the example species when it comes to this, but many seabirds, particularly off of California, have been found to be impacted and have similar effects. But this is from that diatom I had mentioned, Pseudonychia, which produces domoic acid. There are frequent, almost annual blooms of this off the coast of California and the Pacific Northwest in general. Just the past couple of summers, we've been dealing with major marine mammal mortalities and issues, but oftentimes it's also impacting birds. And what will happen is these pelicans, for example, will find themselves landing in just odd locations. It'll be in the middle of a busy beach, a parking lot of a restaurant where there's lots of people around, and they're kind of in these weird places. They can't really stand up straight. They kind of have this frayed feather look, and in really severe toxin ingestion or impacts, they'll be swaying back and forth. They'll be having seizures. Oftentimes they can be rehabilitated from this, but sometimes they can't. But it can be a very visceral, and very obvious issue when you have these birds landing in very busy areas, very busy beaches. It can be one of the first signs that potentially offshore that there's a pseudonychia bloom happening, and that can oftentimes be a trigger or an early warning that enhanced sampling or enhanced monitoring needs to occur. Another example involving, this is again back to that one species I mentioned earlier, Alexandrium catanella, that produces saxitoxin. But in 2019, a team from USGS, led by Caroline Van Emmert, really did a fantastic job at not only responding to a Arctic tern mortality event that happened at 2 colonies off the coast or near Juneau, but really linking that not only with a co-occurrence of an Alexandrium bloom, but really doing the due diligence to not only understand the saxitoxin loads within the Arctic terns themselves, but also on one of their key prey species, and that's the sand lance, Pacific sand lance that you see in that in the image on the left there. Sand lance are really increasingly becoming a pretty likely vector to many of these seabird species. I was hearing several years ago, I was on Kodiak in Alaska, some anecdotal evidence of sand lance issues associated with puffin colonies and potential likelihood of mortality, at least some small amounts of mortality among chicks that were believed to be from sand lance that had saxitoxin in them. Again, weren't able to be confirmed, but kind of, sand lance really appearing to be a common source, or at least a common vector potentially for transition or transmittal of these toxins to bird species. So, but one of the challenges, and I alluded to this earlier in the talk, and this is a picture of a mirror that I took when I was on Savunga that had deceased and had washed up on shore, and another picture of a flyer that was up in the community center in Savunga. And oftentimes you get these mortality events, particularly in remote areas like Alaska, where this is becoming more common, where you get these events. And the immediate question that you have to ask is, what's causing this? Is it from starvation? Is it from some type of avian disease, which we know are increasing in prevalence? Or is it from a HAB toxin, which again, we also know is occurring with increasing prevalence? And I highlight here, I think most of you probably saw the popular media about the science study that was published late last fall about the large mortality event. I think it was some 4 million common mirrors that died over a fairly lengthy period in the Bering Sea region. And one of the things I'll highlight is it took many years to figure out what actually what caused this mortality event. HABs was one of those causative factors that was being investigated. Now, in this particular instance, that was not linked to harmful algal blooms. It was linked to an anomalous, sort of fairly lengthy stretch of warm water that was sort of, colloquially known as the blob. I think some of you may have heard that term. That was resulting in some fairly substantive ecosystem changes in the Bering Sea and resulting in widespread starvation of common murres. But I bring this up because not only to highlight the challenge in articulating and linking what's causing some of these mortality events, for which HABs are sometimes the cause of it. But I also want to highlight some sort of emerging science that's coming out. And I decided not to include graphs here or figures around, dosing studies, but that same USGS team that was looking at the Arctic terns, led by Caroline Van Emmert, I've also been looking at dosing saxitoxin with captive common murres. And one of the interesting emerging findings that they're still waiting to publish, but it's kind of emerging science, is that there appears to be some fairly significant chronic impacts. While the saxitoxin wasn't killing common murres, it was resulting in decreased feeding and really to some degree starvation amongst these birds. And then once the saxitoxin was removed, they were actually able to recover. And so when you think about something like these anomalous warm water events, co-occurring with potentially harmful algae and other bird diseases, it really is highlighting the need. And I think for an emerging area of science is, not just understanding what the impacts of harmful algae are on birds, but what is it when you integrate a multi-stressor in a phenomenon such as anomalously warm water leading to ecosystem changes, coupled with potential saxitoxin exposure and potentially even co-occurrence with some avian diseases. And I highlight in particular the warm water aspect of that, because I am going to show you a little science now of, in particular, the genus of species that produces saxitoxin. So I mentioned Alexandrium cattanella in Alaska. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a related species, Alexandrium fundigans, that occurs in the northeast Atlantic. But this species basically has multiple life stages, and so one of the highlights here that I think is important to key in on is this number one in the bottom right figure, the cyst. And so what happens is when this species blooms, what it does is eventually it goes through this life cycle phase, and eventually it forms a cyst, which is effectively a resting body. Think about a seed that you would get with a plant that can get settle on the bottom and can even get covered by sediment, can get moved around by tides, by currents, by waves, and then eventually something triggers it to bloom. And temperature is a big cause of that. And so here's another figure from the Woods Hole team that's working in the Bering Sea with us and highlighting some of the science that they've been finding. And so if you think about, cyst being transported in particular into northern reaches of the Bering Sea or the Chukchi Sea, where it's pretty darn cold, most of the science points to it's really too cold oftentimes for these resting cysts to germinate and form blooms of Alexandrium. But with these warming waters and with these anomalous warm water events such as the blob, that's what it takes to germinate these seeds. And so this again is highlighting sort of this co-occurrence of stressors that's causing significant ecosystem changes, particularly in locations like the Bering Sea, that's linking multiple stressors to organisms like birds and the impacts that we're seeing potentially. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to now highlight some of this cyst work, because understanding what those cysts are and how they're presenting themselves allows us to forecast what essentially and when a bloom is going to occur. And so I'm going to transition now to the Gulf of Maine. And what you see on the right there is a sampling station where for the past 10 years or so, actually for much longer than that, but I've been involved for about the past 10 years of us going out and sampling for these cysts and forming a grid-like pattern and understanding what that distribution of Alexandrium cysts are in the Gulf of Maine. And so to do that, we're on NOAA vessels. Francesca highlighted that her son is on the Oscar Dyson. It's a ship that looks very similar to this, except for it's on the West Coast. This is the Henry Bigelow, which is stationed on the East Coast. I took this from the Pisces, which is also on the East Coast, and all three of those ships look exactly like this. This is one of our newer fisheries surveys vessels in NOAA. What I will highlight is this also make for great ocean observing platforms. I'll get into that here a little later. But this is what we're going out to sample from. And to do that, we are deploying what's known as a CRABE core. It's a modified CRABE core. Here is me with a colleague on the Nancy Foster just this past spring, going to deploy the CRABE core. It was actually one of the randomly very calm days. And so this should present a video for you, just showing the A-frame of the vessel slowly deploying the CRABE core. What happens is this goes down to the bottom. You can see the weights in about the center of the core there. And so what happens is once it hits the bottom, the pressure that's holding tension on it releases, and those weights push the core down. And then as we lift it back up, a bottom clicks underneath and it pulls up a fairly intact core. We then sample that for the number of cysts that are occurring in the sediment. And we were able to develop what's known as a cyst map, highlighting the densities or quantifying the densities of those cysts in a given year. We then match that up with oceanographic measurements that we're making, such as water temperature and conductivity, tides and currents. That's an example of an output from the device we use for that on the left. And then we can develop a forecast based on that, based on the current environmental conditions of the subsequent summer's bloom, about where it's going to occur potentially and where it's going to go, providing foreknowledge about where enhanced sampling might want to happen or some other type of mitigation activity. So coming back now to the Gulf of Maine, and one thing I'll highlight here is, I'm out on these ships and I'm doing sampling, but I bird when I can. And so Basically, I typically work what's known as the 12 to 4 shift. And so we work in 8 hours off, 4 hours on rotation. And so I work 12 a.m. to 4 a.m. and 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. when I'm on the ship. It's actually horrific, quite frankly, for sleeping. Nothing like setting an alarm for 11:30 p.m. to wake up and go to work. But what it allows me to do is, by about sunrise, I force myself to get up and I go out on the top of the ship or wherever I can on the vessel, and I try to do as much birding as I can. The oval on the right, you'll see in the Gulf of Maine. This is typically where the best birding is on the Gulf of Maine. Not too surprising. And I include an image here on the left, highlights what some of the bathymetric or oceanographic features are. More roughly aligns with the Jordan Basin and the Wilkinson Basin. But at any rate, I'll sort of talk about some of the birding that I get to do on these vessels as I'm out helping to sample for Alexandrium cis. Mostly highlighting birds in the Gulf of Maine, but as we were talking before we joined this past year in March of 2024, we did so off the coast of Kodiak, and so had some really cool things going on there as well. So just to give you a bird's eye view of what things look like, this is actually from the Oscar Dyson. So this is off the shore of Kodiak. This is what it looks like when I'm standing up on the top deck above the bridge looking for birds. And so this is a fairly typical day off of Alaska, kind of an ups and downs, topsy-turvy, very gray background. And it makes for a lot of fun looking for small little murrelets and other alcids. But at any rate, I can tell you right now, there's no place I'd rather be than that view right there. The smell, the up and down actually kind of is relaxing to me. And just the promise of what's going to be next, what species is going to pop up that I didn't expect is just, to me, it's just flat awesome. And so here are some of the species. I'm going to go back to the Gulf of Maine actually now. You would expect, so we're typically out in October doing these surveys. Once we've been out in February, occasionally early on, it was in November, but typically we're out in October. Still lots of good numbers of shearwaters out at this time. Great shearwaters, Corey shearwaters have had 1 scopoles, decent numbers of nanks. And then usually each cruise once a year, I get 1 or 2 sooty shearwater that are still flying around the Gulf of Maine. Northern fulmars are almost always in decent numbers, as well as decent numbers, slightly smaller than fulmars of mostly Palmer and Jaegers. Occasionally get a parasitic, but mostly Palmers. I've had once or twice. I've had skua, brown skua. Sorry, not brown, South Polar skua. But they're pretty rare. But what gets me excited, particularly in October, is not the seabirds. Yeah, it's fun seeing great shearwaters. It's great seeing northern fulmars. Usually get an odd puff in here too at that time of year. But that's migration. And one of the most fascinating things to me has been watching the passerine migration. And if you think about the that oval that I drew, roughly corresponding to about the center of the Gulf of Maine over the Jordan and Wilkinson Basin, that's also where I typically see the most passerines. And so I've had upwards of probably 50 species of passerine either landing on the ship or passing by the ship. And you've got mourning doves. One of the cool things, I think it was back in 2020, there was a large finch movement down south from up north. And so I saw that on the ship. Lots of purple finches, lots of pine siskins, lots of red-breasted nuthatch that year landing on the ship. I was pretty surprised this past year to have eastern meadowlark. I had a bunch of kinglets this past October. Lots of sparrows, particularly if I go in early, later October, early November. Highlight was this, I was really floored about 2 years ago. I came out, here's a lark sparrow. I'm like, holy cow, that's pretty surprising. But marsh wren, gray catbird, a handful of warblers, everything from black-throated blues to common yellowthroats to parulas. Excuse me. All landing on the ship. One of the things I'll highlight, it's always occurred to me, is the ship a bad thing, a good thing, or a neutral thing when it comes to these migrating birds? In other words, the ships are pretty dark at night, but they do have lights. And so is this, distracting? We all know about the issues that lights can have with migration of birds, or are we bringing birds offshore if we're, happen to be moving offshore during the evening hours? And I, basically what I'll say is this. My observation, and this was really highlighted to me this past October, is there was a constant conveyor belt in the middle of the day of birds flying in, either flying around and going, or landing for a brief time and then keep continuing on. And I think, at least from my unscientific, at least no analysis done opinion, it's likely a slight net benefit. And it certainly is if you're a peregrine falcon, because I see a lot of these off the Gulf of Maine every year. They are clearly migrating over the water as part of their natural movement from Nova Scotia going down to Cape Cod or somewhere else. And as you might expect, these tired land birds that are on the ship make for a decent snack for these peregrines. And so you often find carcasses, unfortunately, but it helps to sustain the peregrines. And so it's part of life. My favorite sighting so far in the Gulf of Maine is this one. I was completely floored this past October to see an American woodcock fly about where that star is past our ship. I was about 60 to 70 miles from the furthest point of land. And so, I started posting this around the Maine Birding Facebook page. And eventually the University of Maine reached out to me. Some scientists there have been attaching satellite transmitters to American woodcock in Nova Scotia, trying to document their southward migration. And so I took a little image of theirs from their website in the bottom left there. And you can see they've documented these birds are flying out over the Gulf of Maine on their way south as part of the migration. But the cool thing about this is these satellite transmitters that they've implanted into the birds or attached to the birds are not only providing spatial location, but altimetry data. And that's important because they're doing this for studying potential impacts from the placement of offshore wind farms in this area. But those altimeters are fairly inaccurate. And so this was the first documented, at least that they were aware of and that I could find, image of American woodcock migrating over water and showing how high, or at least what the altitude, really there is no altitude, it's right off the surface of the water, but how high they're flying off the water. And so they're pretty excited because it actually validated some of the altimeter data that they have from their implanted woodcock. So obviously you might expect other species that are kind of cool occurring out there. Several species of dolphin, mulla mulla. Whales aren't so common that time of year. We get occasionally some fin whales. We've had a couple humpbacks, but not that all too common. Probably one of the craziest events that I've been out there with in the Gulf of Maine was this past October. I think everybody here in Maryland saw the northern lights that occurred. Imagine being offshore with zero light pollution. Further north, it was completely incredible, completely enveloping of the ship, and also completely eerie at the same time. The sad part is getting a photo is next to impossible because you can imagine moving around on a ship. The night photos didn't turn out too well, but just an incredible experience looking at the northern lights offshore, well offshore on a vessel with minimal light pollution. Last thing I'll highlight is a cool megapod of dolphins that I encountered off of George's Bank. And so this was a neat occurrence that happened in 2020. We saw about, I don't know, at least 1,000, if not probably several thousand of these dolphin. The cool thing about it is they would come off in little pods of like 3 to 4, come over, bow ride the ship for a bit and then depart. And then you would see kind of the next group come, and it was almost like they were taking turns playing a little game. But really cool experience. This went on for miles and miles of seeing these sort of massive like pods of dolphin. Just a really cool and neat experience. So I'm going to transition now to Kodiak. And one thing I'll say is I love Kodiak. Francesca, I don't know if you've heard from Luca how much he likes it or doesn't like it, but I think Kodiak is just a really cool place. Highly recommend it. It's an easy flight from Anchorage if you're ever in Anchorage in particular to get down there. Easy to navigate with the road system. There's not many roads to begin with. And there's some pretty cool birding here. But what you can see is the eBird map from the cruise that we did last March. Mostly working around the island of Kodiak. We had to go up to Homer to make a quick stop. And so kind of go from there. So here's kind of what Kodiak looks like. It's very much a fishing community. Really cool group of stellar sea lions hangs out in the small boat harbor there. Great time of year. It does bring in some orca. So you do get a chance to potentially see that right from town. But just a cool place. Lots of mountains. Cool vibe to the community. There's even a little brewery there. Just a place that I highly recommend. And there's actually some pretty good birding there. So again, in March, I've been there a couple times now, but when I was there in March, I remember sitting on the back deck of the Oscar Dyson. We were at port, and I did a simple just 365-degree turn where I just counted every single bald eagle that I could count within visual sight on one turn. And I counted 93, which I thought was cool. But they get like 700-800 on their Christmas bird count. And they're mostly there being attracted to the fish processing facilities. But just an incredible number of bald eagles. But you can still get some of your Pacific Northwest specialties like varied thrush, had white-winged crossbill, rudd crossbill. There's fox sparrows. One of the higher densities in terms of in easier places to go find emperor goose. So Women's Bay, not too far down from the Coast Guard facility there, has a pretty high population of wintering emperor goose. So if you need that for your life list and try to figure out a good way to get it, or you want to see a lot of them, that's one place to consider. Moving now offshore. So here's some of the stuff that we had, or I had, including some what I thought were some pretty cool birds. Obviously, king eider is not too surprising up there. Lots of fulmars, black-legged kittiwakes were everywhere. But a couple of the cooler birds that we had was I had this loon pop up not too far actually from Kodiak City when we were still a little bit offshore. I thought it looked a little bit odd, so I snapped some photos and corresponded with some folks, and it was a yellow-billed loon, and they usually have a couple there that winter each year, and so winter plumage, not the cool-looking summer plumage, but nonetheless a pretty cool bird. My highlight for me was a self-found slaty-back gull, which is on the lower right there. I found this bird flying amongst other gulls off about the southern coast of Kodiak, so I was pretty excited about that. I'll mention alcids. I talked about at the onset with that video of me, or video from the top of the ship and the moving waves. I had a philosophy that I had to employ when it came to alcids of take pictures now, ask questions, and identify later. Basically, you're getting the small little specks. If you're lucky, they fly away like this marbled murrelet did on the top left there. Most of the time, they skitter for about 2 feet on the surface of the water before diving, and that's all you got. And so I try to take as many pictures as I can, identify them later, and figure it out. The other part is separating some of these alcids up there, particularly in winter, is a lot of fun. And so this one's clearly a marbled murrelet, but we were starting to get into transitional plumage time. And so some of the birds that I took photos of were murrelet SP, because is it a Kitlitz's or is it a marbled? It was unclear. Same thing for a lot of the murres up there. And so common murre was pretty common, the predominant murre species. But again, it was that transitional time from a plumage perspective. And so it was getting a little tough to tell, okay, actually, is that a thick-billed murre? Is it a common murre? And there was a number of times I took pictures of murre flocks only to zoom in and be like, oh, nope, those are thick-billeds, those are commons. And so, really a philosophy, if you ever go out on, a vessel like this, take pictures and identify later was, I think, the winning mantra of the day. I mentioned this picture that's coming up here next. This was actually taken by Francesca's sons, Luca, who was an ensign on the ship on the Oscar Dyson with a crested auklet that landed. This bird was completely healthy, but these birds can't just take off without much of a runway, and so we had to pick it up and release it into the air. That's actually the bird flying away there on the top right. But this was just pretty cool. I mean, I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd be able to handle a crested auklet. Bird was feisty. It was ready to fly. But it was also happy to get a helping hand because it obviously wasn't going to be able to get up itself. The bottom right there was actually not long before I took this picture, or before this auklet landed on the ship. That's a group of crested auklet, and that group flew alongside at about a distance, I would say, of probably close to a half mile to a mile for a while, moving pretty fast and slowly going away. And this is another example of take pictures and figure it out, because they look like a black mass in person. Zooming in, you could start to make out that they were all blackbirds, they were alcids, and kind of from there worked out that they were crested auklets. But really just an absolutely cool experience being able to handle this crested auklet. My last slide that I'm going to show you is some of the other goodies that you can get in Alaska. The top left is finally, after spending a fair amount of time on Kodiak, was my first Kodiak brown bear. This was actually on the backside of Kodiak in a pretty remote bay called Larsen Bay. And this guy was pretty far away, strolling the beach. So an early emerger from its winter hibernation. Again, this was in late March. But the whales up there, oh my gosh. So when we started out on the cruise, whales were just starting to arrive. There weren't that many offshore. By the time we finished, they were becoming almost an afterthought. They were becoming almost boring. Really not, but just they were common. They were everywhere. Humpbacks, fin whales, gray whales. The bottom right was just part of a really neat, I would say 12-hour span from an evening to morning in the mouth of Larsen Bay on the back of Kodiak. Actually, was it Uac Bay? I can't recall the exact one, but a remote bay. And in the evening, you could look out over the bay, and it was like a fountain show of just spouts coming up at random times. It was like one of those things you see in Las Vegas, like at a, with the fountains, sprouting up, and it was just phenomenal to watch. And then the next morning, there was a handful, probably at least a half dozen to maybe 10 of these fin whales actively feeding off the stern of the ship. The crew actually deployed an ROV, remote operated vehicle. And there was you could see what they're feeding on. They were feeding on lots of tiny krill, small fish, and other organisms that were just completely thick in the water in this area. Just really cool to see that kind of food chain based progression from those krill on up to the whales. Lots of sea otters. I mentioned the stellar sea lions, but with that, I'm happy to take any questions, and hopefully that was some level of informative to you, and at least hopefully had some interest to you as well from the birding perspective. And so I'm going to go ahead and escape out of this. And yeah, if you have any questions.
I'll just say thank you for making me feel close to my son for a few minutes.
I think that's so cool.
He loves it. He's absolutely loving it. And he's going to be in Newport, Oregon for his next billet.
Oh, is he? Good. A little closer to home. A little easier to get back and forth to the East Coast.
Yeah. Kodiak we haven't been able to get up there to see him, but someday.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. That was excellent.
I have another question if no one else does. I just didn't want to hog it.
Yeah, go right ahead.
I'm just curious. My other son actually does mariculture in Maine. And how big of an impact does this have? I mean, it just feels like as the lobsters become more difficult up there, more and more of the communities are switching to oysters and other things. And, is that like a really kind of dumb thing to do with climate change? Is it just going to get worse and more blooms and people getting sick? And anyway, I just wondered.
Yeah, there's a number of layers to that. So yes, it does impact mariculture, seafood, and there's some of the principal stakeholders for the folks that we're providing information to about these blooms. And so the answer is yes. Particularly in Maine, there's a fairly robust state-led monitoring effort. There's this fairly robust testing effort in Maine. Oftentimes when I talk about harmful algae, particularly with seafood and shellfish, people ask me, well, do you eat mussels? And yeah, I do. I eat them. Particularly in some place like Maine where there's a fair level of confidence. You can't be sure, but there's a fair level of confidence and a lot of science going in to help, ensure that the risk is minimized, not zero, but is minimized. But that's happening elsewhere. It's happening in Alaska, for example, where there's a push to increase the amount of mariculture, and there the infrastructure is less. And so there's a lot of science going on right now, not only to better forecast. And so, hey, aquaculture facility, stop harvesting or start testing your mussels because you've got a bloom heading your way, but also improving the ability for us to more rapidly test for those toxins to enable more increased selling of those resources. So yeah, it's a concern. Would I say it should stop it? No, I don't. And I do eat seafood myself, but the risk isn't zero. If you go to a remote Alaskan, lodge and they're picking shellfish off the shore and feeding it to you, I might pause on that one.
Yeah, sorry, one more follow-up. I mean, I remember in the, 81, 82, 83, living in the Virgin Islands, and paralytic shellfish poisoning was huge. Is it still? I mean, it was like you didn't even want to go spearfishing or eat anything that was big, but it was just, it was fish as well. Is that one of the organisms that you were talking about?
So that one I think you're probably referring to is what's known as ciguatoxin. That's
right.
It's a benthic algae that can get into fish and that's a tough one. And that's a big issue in the Caribbean, tropical Pacific, particularly in remote islands. It goes. It's still an issue.
So I thought you mentioned that when you did the monitoring and you saw and you could predict where the blooms were occurring. Yeah, I'm sorry. Some people keep meeting, and you could predict where the blooms were going, and I thought you said something about maybe taking mitigation
Yeah.
actions? What sort of mitigation can you?
Yeah, the big ones are, so what you're trying to mitigate against is obviously human health impacts, economic impacts, and so that mitigation really does depend on the species, the potential impact in terms of what the risk would be, as well as the location or the region. And so in Florida, that might be targeted closures of beaches because of a red tide that's causing respiratory distress, or but in the past, and I think context here is important, there would be a red tide and they would just, hey, none of the beaches are safe. Now we're at the ability where we can say, okay, there's a red tide. This beach is likely fine. Don't go to this one. So it can be more targeted. And so if you think about if you're a restaurant that's on the beach there, you'd rather that targeted effort than a blanket warning or something like that. And the same would apply for the mariculture facilities or recreational harvests of shellfish, where if you can target closures, if you can minimize the breadth of closures, that right there is going to have benefits economically, but more importantly, if you can stop an event from happening. And so, for instance, off the coast of Washington, recreational razor clam digs are huge. It's a huge economic event, huge cultural sort of tourism type activity. It's been stopped a number of years, and that's because of domoic acid. And so, yes, there's economic impact, but nobody got sick. Nobody was at risk of going to the hospital. And that, ultimately, that's what we're trying to prevent, and that's what we're trying to mitigate. Mitigate human illnesses, mitigate the impacts as much as possible. The ecosystem impacts, that's tougher. That's much tougher.
Yeah, that's what so you mean for human impact, but there's probably nothing that people can conceive of to do about mitigating ecosystem and wildlife impacts.
The best thing is like for those strandings of like brown pelicans that I highlighted off California, same thing with like sea lions that'll have similar impacts, is bring them into care facilities, and they can recover with care. And so we have had event response activities where there's a massive bloom, there's a massive ecosystem impacts, and so we've, the state and others have, and the federal agencies have, ramped up funding to those rehabilitators so that they have the capacity and they have the means to rehabilitate. But that's about as close as it gets that I've seen, at least.
Yeah, I figured. But yeah, that's cool. We're also getting some nice thank you messages in the chat. I'm just going to check to see if there are any questions here.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you for the informative presentation. Said, I went to Tuxedni Island. I'm probably saying that wrong. In Alaska many years ago, and saw the horned
Puffins.
Horned puffins. Yeah, these puffins are the most beautiful puffins. Okay, and here's a question. Are freshwater habs produced by the same organisms as saltwater habs?
No, they're not. They're not even in the same kingdom, honestly.
Okay.
Although they're lumped together, colloquially as a harmful algal bloom. So most of the saltwater and marine habs are either going to be dinoflagellates or diatoms, which have particular features associated with them. One way to think about that would be, mammals versus plants versus fungi. The freshwater ones are usually caused by cyanobacteria. And so they're actually not an algae. They're cyanobacteria. They're their own thing. But they can form blooms, oftentimes with that kind of neon green color. And they produce toxins, some pretty nasty toxins, actually. And so that's why they get lumped together from a sort of a communications and sort of programmatic based perspective. But from the organism perspective, they're very different.
Oh, that's interesting. David, you tell a great story, both with words and photos. Lots of compliments here. Any other questions?
Just that when Commander Rose comes in March, because she's going to be back off the Oscar Dyson and back here, we'll have to take her birding together.
I think that sounds like an awesome idea.
Okay.
And if I recall, she plays drums too. I think she's the one that has a drum set in her cabin, which is pretty cool.
She's pretty interesting as a commanding officer.
Yeah.
And she's been so good to Luca. Just a fabulous role model. Fabulous.
That's awesome.
Well, David, this is Chris Wright. I was in Florida for one of the red tides right in the Fort McMurray area a while ago, and it was pretty stifling. The suggestion there was that a lot of this is caused by pollution from development. Is it true that enriching the waters enriches the pollution causing algae?
Yeah, so that is a highly complex question. It is one that is actively being studied right now. And so what I will tell you is a bit of my, I don't want to say opinion, but my observation based on the science that I'm seeing. But recognize that I would say that the conclusive science is still quote unquote out on that. So let me be very clear what I'm talking about also, because South Florida is very dynamic and it is very complex. So red tide, the one that causes the respiratory distress, is a species known as Carenia brevis. However, also in South Florida, you get other harmful algae species, including cyanobacteria that occur in Lake Okeechobee that can get sent down to the coast for one reason or another and cause some impacts. And so what I'm about to say is purely focused on the Carenia brevis with a red tide, which is the true marine species that causes that respiratory distress. And it's probably what you had, that you encountered. So Carenia brevis is a naturally occurring species. We are fairly confident the blooms have been occurring for as long as there have been algae down there. There are also signs that the blooms themselves likely are initiated by naturally occurring phenomenon. There's been theories around hurricane kind of stirring things up, potentially precipitating a bloom, other theories as well. It's still out, but at least the leading science is suggesting that the initiation of that bloom is likely naturally occurring. There is some science starting to point in some areas in South Florida that there might be some enhancement or continued maintenance of the bloom, potentially coming from land-based nutrient sources. In other words, the bloom's naturally occurring. It might have ended sooner, but because there's some nutrients coming in, it's potentially maintaining that for a longer time or enhancing it in some areas. But that is literally, I'm getting a briefing tomorrow on this topic, literally, by some of the scientists doing the work. And so it is an emerging area that there is still some debate on, but it looks like there's at least some connection, but I can say that it's likely not the entire connection to the red tide issue. Bit of a wishy-washy answer, but that's because that's where we are science-wise.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
One other question just came in. Says, great pics. And what equipment are you using?
Yeah, I'm not a photographer. My goal, I'm a birder. Everybody asks, I'm not a photographer. I am a birder. I'm there to document. And I like to travel light. And so I have a Sony RX10 Mark IV. I love this camera. Highly recommended. It's not cheap. It's probably I would argue the best point and shoot that you can get for a variety of reasons. But it packs well, travels well, and in my opinion, picks pretty decent pictures.
Obviously, yeah. What was that again? A Sony?
Sony RX10 Mark IV.
Cool. Hey. Other than a few more compliments, that's it on the chat. Anyone else? Mark, you.
No, I see Gail's online. Gail, you used to be an oceanographer. Do you have any questions for David? Well, maybe she's not online.
I put her to sleep.
I thought she was going to have some question. When you went to Maryland, she wasn't teaching then, was she, David?
No,
Were you-
no, no. Yeah, no, I did for my graduate work. I did work on dinoflagellates, but they caused blooms, but they weren't ones that caused toxins, and more a matter of they bloomed when the weather conditions were waters warmed, nutrients came down, and it's not quite the same issue, although there have been some problematic blooms in the bay since I left studying it. I was going to say to David that my best bird on a oceanographic trip was we were up the west coast of Peru during El Nino. It was on a Scripps vessel, and we were lowering, they were doing mostly geophysics, lowering the Rosette sampler all the way to the bottom of the Pacific Trench. So it took hours to take it down and bring it back up. We were on station at all night, 24 hours. And about midnight, a flock of swallowtail gulls came in, and because they're not night feeders, and circled the ship. And my husband was there too, and he said it was sort of like a flock of barn owls coming out of the dark and suddenly all flying around the ship. And it was amazing. Getting squid, the squid would come.
Yep.
We had all the lights on the Melville, and that was pretty good. Actually got a paper out of that one too.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
Not
we
out
we
of
used
the
to, like,
swallowtail gulls, but out of the El Nino birding, because none of the birds in the Galapagos bred that year because of the warm water, and so they were at sea. So we had some very interesting encounters, but those years ago.
yeah. Yeah, we see that when we're sampling at night, because there's big floodlights that are illuminating where your samplers, as you know, Gail, but for everybody else, there's big floodlights illuminating the water where your samplers are going in. And so that starts to attract fish. You start seeing fish that are at the surface there, which then starts attracting birds. I almost got whacked by a fork-tailed storm petrel up in Alaska last year that kind of was flying in and kind of came into the sampling area. So it's fun to see what the lights attract there, because some of the birds have a nice easy buffet, unfortunately, for the fish as a result.
Yeah, we would get birds on. I've got a photo of my husband holding a ringed storm petrel and a wedge rump storm petrel. We had a box on board, and the graduate students, if anything was on board, they had a big box that was labeled birds. And you'd open the box in the morning, you didn't really know what was in it. And it's usually be some little storm petrels looking up at you very beseechingly.
Yes.
Pretty funny. Anyway, good times.
One more thing, David, I got to ask, do you have a state list for Alaska, a bird list?
I do. What it is, I don't 100% recall. Maybe 150, let's call it, something like that.
Good.
David, did you ever get far enough out on the Aleutians to get whiskered auklet?
No, we weren't fairly close to the southern tip of Kodiak. We're going back out, hopefully, in May, and we're going to be a little further offshore. I don't think we're going to still get quite far enough out on the Aleutians for whiskered auklet, but I am fingers crossing for some special albatross.
Yeah. Short-tailed albatross, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we did actually a cruise from Japan to actually to Vancouver, and we went to Unalaska, and we did get whiskered auklet. Yeah, right off the ship, because there were so many birds in the water that the ship was down to just barely steerage way, and they'd be right in front of the ship and they go bloop, go down.
Yeah,
it's really funny.
Yep.
So if you get out there, you have a chance.
Yep. Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Okay.
And we went and visited Luca in October and had a fabulous trip. We were just there for like 10 days, but they were dry docked in Seward. So we took him and did Seward and Homer and Denali, and actually got to see Denali and a hawk owl.
And it is Denali.
That is Denali, still in my book, and a hawk owl on the way down from Denali. So it's really, I highly recommend Alaska, and going after September is great because you can actually drive in the park. You don't have to take the shuttle buses because they allow cars in after that. But I will say, coming down from Denali in like the end of October was cold, sleety. We just hit it right on the edge of what was. And I'll say Lucas has seen one Kodiak bear, and it was at the dump on Kodiak.
We keep being told that there's like more Kodiak bears than people on Kodiak, but yeah, that's literally the only one that I've seen, is that one from a distance from the ship last year.
Yeah, we were on Kodiak birding with a local birder walking along this road, and some guy came along in a pickup truck, and he said, around the corner is one of the biggest brown bears you've ever seen. And we said, okay, thank you. And we turned around and went the other way. And that was not too far from town. So
Yeah.
once in a while. Yeah. Anyway, great talk, David. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right, well, Emily, you think there are no more questions? We should probably end the meeting, and thank you again, David, very much for a terrific PowerPoint presentation there.
No problem. Hope to see folks around the county birding here at some point soon.